All right, I'm letting folks in.
Welcome everyone to our webinar on stretch code proposals. It's an info session for municipal stakeholders as part of our Codes for Climate series at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. So happy to have you here today. Folks are still coming in, so I'm going to give it another minute or so, and then we'll get started. All right, welcome everyone again today to our info session for municipal stakeholders on the stretch code proposals. So excited to have you here today. This is part of our Codes for Climate series at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. My name is Cami Peterson. I'm the Director of Clean Energy at MAPC and really happy to have you all here today, as well as our presenters from the Department of Energy Resources. So thanks all for joining us late in the day here on a Wednesday. I'm really looking forward to having this discussion. Let me go on to our next slide. You all will have seen when you joined us that this webinar is being recorded. If you do not wish to participate in that recording, you do have the option to leave the meeting and or leave yourself off camera. We will be remaining muted throughout the webinar as is, but please make sure you are comfortable with being recorded. And the purposes of that is so that we can share the recording as well as the slides following this webinar with those who are not able to attend today or wanted to return to it. Our agenda today is to spend some time really talking about, discussing, answering some questions related to the two straw proposals on the update to the stretch code and the new municipal opt-in specialized code that the Department of Energy Resources released back on February 8th. So we will spend a little bit of time just now kind of going over what today looks like, doing a tiny bit of housekeeping. I'll take a few minutes to talk through the priority that codes is for MAPC, how we see it a very important tool in advancing climate goals for the Commonwealth and all of our cities and towns. And we'll definitely take a good amount of time to hear from the Department of Energy Resources, have them answer a number of those questions that some of you submitted ahead of time. Thank you to those who did that, as well as I ask you all, for those who are interested in any clarifying questions, to please input those into the chat throughout the presentation today. And as time allows, after the Q&A section of answering some of those pre-submitted questions, we'll get to as many of those clarifying questions in the chat as possible. As I mentioned, folks will remain on mute today, but I will be pulling off those questions from the chat, so really encourage you to add them there. And again, thank you to those who submitted questions ahead of time. On the housekeeping note, just to ensure that everyone is safe and comfortable in this setting, a good 2 years into our Zoom etiquette, I know many of you feel very familiar with that, but just a reminder to folks to please behave appropriately. If there is any misbehavior, then we will require that that person leave the Zoom setting. So just a reminder there for that. After the Q&A, we'll save a few minutes at the end to discuss how you can participate in the stretch code and opt-in code process going forward, both in the near term and then a little bit more in the longer term, as well as some resources, MAPC and otherwise, that you can look to connect with. Just a very quick introduction to who we are at MAPC for those who might not be familiar. We're the regional planning agency for the 101 cities and towns of Metro Boston, a mission-based public agency created by the legislature over 50 years ago. We have over 100 employees that work with these cities and towns and across the Commonwealth. Our clean energy division does work in a number of areas related to clean energy, energy efficiency, and renewable energy, as well as climate mitigation and resilience across a number of different ways in projects and planning, programming, and procurement, providing technical assistance as well, support, education, awareness building. Have done a lot of work on codes over the years and in building decarbonization, both at the local, regional, and state level. And so we're very happy to be continuing this conversation today. We really see net zero as a framework for holistic climate planning. It's been one of our primary frameworks to move our work forward over the last 3 to 4 years, and see it as having the potential to be a vehicle for multi-benefit outcomes. A better building, a net zero building, or net zero as a means for climate action in general can lead to really productive energy outcomes, economic development, workforce development outcomes, equity, diversity, and inclusion outcomes, better public health outcomes, and increased livability for all. In that work, buildings has become a particular focus of our work. As you can see here with numbers that were updated last in the fall of 2020, with data partially through 2019, building consumption continues to be the second largest sector of our emissions after transportation, and just a really big chunk of that carbon footprint. And so looking to see how we can reduce those emissions, decarbonize, and make our buildings healthier and more safe and comfortable for all those multi-benefit outcomes is a huge priority of ours, and a place that we've been focusing a number of our programs and policy efforts. As we move away from fossil fuels in those decarbonization efforts, there's a lot that we can get to through electrification. And this simple illustration shows that in just simply moving away from gas heat in a boiler, for instance, to electric heat from a heat pump, in just 2018 grid numbers, that's a very significant decrease in the amount of carbon that's produced per unit of energy. And as you look out to the grid in 2050, obviously it gets much, much cleaner. And there's much that we can do through that simple transition from gas to electricity. And so that's been something that's a critical key in unlocking the building decarbonization efforts that we are looking at. So if you take into account, what you can get through electrifying our space heating and our hot water, the thermal demands in our buildings, add to it very robust energy efficient envelopes for our buildings. So those enclosures, those envelopes are well insulated, weatherized to the extent that they can be to make the energy demand as little as it is, electrify what's left there, and then provide that electricity through renewable energy, all to the extent possible throughout all three of these. You have the formula for getting to net zero in the way that we've been looking at it. So that's the magical mix that we see to help us move forward that building decarbonization sector that we've been focusing on. And that really brings to the surface why codes are so critical. We see that as one of the major levers in being able to advance this work. But there are a number of ways that we can look to improve our buildings, especially from the perspective of cities and towns, and ways that they can impact local level building policy or affect that at the state level. So, one of the things that we can do is what part of the process right now, DOER will be talking more about the public hearings that are starting as early as this evening. And that's for, giving public comment on both the stretch energy code proposal as well as the new municipal opt-in specialized net zero code. There's opportunities throughout the process, through the base code process at the BBRS to provide comment there as well. Cities and towns can adopt the stretch energy code or the new municipal opt-in net zero code as of December for the latter of 2022. So that's an action that cities and towns can take to advance their energy efficiency and climate efforts for their building sector. There's also zoning and other local ordinances they can do and really complement that as a kind of full package for advancing building decarbonization. And they can enforce that. So not only is it important to adopt these policies, but then to really make sure that they are being enacted and carried out to full effect on the ground. I'll spend just a quick moment here on those local levers. So it's not the purpose of this webinar, but there are a number of different measures that cities and towns can take that they have direct control over, things like BERDO and municipal buildings and zoning. So there's a number of different strategies you see here in the table of contents from MAPC's Municipal Net Zero Playbook. And there's a good amount of information if you click on that link, and I'll provide that at the end too for how to move those strategies forward. But cities and towns cannot, have their own building code. So at the state level, that's a place where they can really have a voice and help to make sure that it's helping to advance the needs that they have. And building codes are life safety codes. Even if you think mainly about the efficiency component, which is a huge part of it, all these benefits come from having a very energy efficient building. Add in, the effect from supplying the electricity through renewables, and you really can get to that magical mix that I was talking about. And so just wanted to provide that context for how we're approaching the critical nature of codes for advancing our climate goals. And with that, I want to turn it over to our colleagues at the Department of Energy Resources. I think, Ian, I'm first turning it to you, but we're here with Ian Finlayson, Paul Ormond, and Joanne Becerra, who'll be sharing their expertise. I've stopped my share, Ian, so hopefully you would be able to do that and take over, and I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, sorry, it's just taking me a little time to get this set up. And Cami, thank you for that great summary. Don't hear people talking about building codes and magical very often, so I appreciate that framing. What we have today is a brief presentation that I think Paul and I will share, just summarizing what is in the stretch code updates. And then we have a list of the questions that was provided to us by MAPC hopefully from this audience. And we will try and run through those as efficiently as we can. And then if there are follow-up questions or additional questions, we hopefully will have a little bit of time for that at the end. For those of you who aren't already fully up to speed on this, this is just sort of a quick overview. Essentially, starting next year, we hope to have a refresh of the energy code options for municipalities with 3 options, where to date there have only been 2. And that's really a function of the new or last year's Climate Act, which created this new specialized opt-in code option. So to help track progress along this route and through 2022, we have a new web page up. I know it's impossible to copy down web links on presentations, but hopefully this can be shared later, or you can just Google Stretch Energy Code Development 2022. Also, if you have signed up for updates, they will send you to links off of this web page. So this is sort of going to be our clearinghouse for information, including the webinar from 2 weeks ago, the recording of that, and subsequent to that, we have another presentation slide deck up summarizing the analysis that's been done. Okay, so let's dive into a recap of the webinar on the stretch code, and then we can get to questions. So I'm going to start with a couple of slides on the residential side. And so this is the stretch code update for current stretch code communities or future stretch code communities. And the residential side is going to look familiar to folks who've been using the stretch code for a while. Right now we have HERS 55 as the primary route for stretch code adoption. We also allow passive house, that's going to continue. And lastly, at the moment, we have Energy Star homes as a pathway, mostly used by multifamily developers. We're dropping the Energy Star homes pathway while working with the EPA on updating that. So their current Energy Star homes version 3.1 was really designed to complement the 2015 IECC code, and we're a long way past that at this point with the adoption of 2021 and then the stretch code building on top of that. So we will be phasing into that, as you see at the bottom of this, but the idea is that by the end of next year, we would, and basically starting in 2024, we would be requiring HERS 42 for fossil fuel heated homes and has 45 for all electric homes in the regular stretch code. Now, when we compare that with the new opt-in or net zero code, the differences here are fairly straightforward. Essentially, we are allowing fossil fuel use in new construction still, and we'll come back to that in questions. But wherever anybody's using fossil fuels, whether it be for heating, water heating, cooking, appliances, then that will trigger a requirement for rooftop solar and a requirement for wiring that home for future conversion to be all electric. And we can get into that in more detail later on as well. If you start with a home that is all electric, then essentially the specialized opt-in code is not asking for much different than the regular stretch code. And if you choose the passive house route, passive house allows either fossil fuel or all electric construction. And so if you choose to use fossil fuels, say for water heating, then you would also have to pre-wire for electrification in the near term. And then one thing that maybe gets overlooked a little bit is across all the building code updates, base code, stretch code, and the opt-in stretch code, we will be bringing in EV ready wiring requirements. So essentially, single family homes will be required to have wiring in place for one car or one vehicle to charge, and then multifamily, 20% of spaces in the opt-in code and 10% of spaces in the base code or stretch code. So that's a very quick summary of residential. I want to hand over to my colleague Paul Ormond to do the same thing for commercial.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, I just have 2 slides on the commercial. We kept just kind of really boiled it down to get it to the most essential key changes for the takeaway here. So in summary, for commercial construction, the key changes are much more stringent air infiltration, energy recovery, and envelope and thermal bridging requirements. We call this the trifecta. We've learned that when you improve those 3 things in tandem at the right levels, you have really, really significant improvements to your building performance, particularly the second bullet, which is concerning the heating and cooling demand limits. So when your trifecta is working well and you have good envelope, air infiltration, and energy recovery, your heating and your cooling loads can be very low. And what we're really concerned about is the heating loads, because that's where you use gas, right? So in addition to our more stringent prescriptive trifecta elements, we're actually proposing a new target in our stretch code called the heating demand intensity target. It's abbreviated TEDI, the thermal energy demand intensity, TEDI. So in past codes with stretch code, we have governed, if you will, the total amount of energy use. The proposed stretch code will also govern the heating use. So that way we make sure that designers are paying attention to making the heating load as small as possible. So this just gives you an example of how much lower the heating loads in our commercial buildings will be. If you look at the red bar, that is the heating load under our current code. Under our proposed commercial stretch code, the heating loads will be those blue bars. You can see that will be in the order of what passive house gets. So if we were to build the building to a passive house standard. So when you do all this, the outcomes are buildings with extremely low emissions. They're very easy to electrify. They reduce or eliminate fossil fuels. It has much improved resiliency because these kind of buildings stay warm in the winter if you lose power, or stay cool in the summer if you lose power. And much better improved comfort. So we're kind of capturing all the benefits of Passive House through these new strategies that are in the proposed code.
Okay, so I'll jump back in now, and we want to go into the Q&A period where we address questions that were submitted in advance. And we've broken those into some topics just to kind of organize them efficiently. So I'm just going to dive in here. Here's our first topic. So there were a number of questions about clarifying the timeline and adoption options for different municipalities for these new codes. And we're going to sort of break that apart a little bit. So this slide is a slide that we put in the webinar, and maybe could take a bit more time to walk through, but essentially we're showing the 3 code choices here on the horizontal rows, and then the timeline that we have for them going across the columns. So we're in the winter of 2022, still some snow on the ground, which is nice. And so we're in the sort of initial public outreach, public hearing phase of the stretch code update and the new specialized opt-in code. And then folks may or may not be aware, but the Board of Building Regulations and Standards, which has jurisdiction over the base code, they have posted proposed updates to the base energy code on their webpage. They've been up for a couple of months, and they're plowing through remaining building code chapters that are not energy related, and then they will have their public hearing on that in the summer, hopefully. On DOER's side, we're now responsible for updating the stretch code and developing the new specialized opt-in code. And so once we close this initial round of public comment just on the straw proposal, that will allow us to finalize some draft code language that we hope to put out later this spring. And then that will start the second round of public hearings and public comments when there is draft code language to respond to. And we broke it up into these 2 stages deliberately to try and make sure that people are not sort of caught short or surprised by this process. And so the goal right now is to kind of get the big picture, high level questions out there and get feedback. And so we appreciate you taking time today, and hopefully in coming to some of the public hearing sessions to give us some feedback at a high level, knowing that we will then be back in the summer with the chance to get input on the more detailed level language. Then we plan to finalize that code language and publish both the stretch code update and the new specialized opt-in code in the fall. And then it starts to be effective in the case of the stretch code, and then available for municipal adoption in the case of the specialized opt-in code. And the way you would adopt the opt-in code is the same as the way historically you've been able to opt into the regular stretch code. So hopefully that is something familiar to many of you, and that our Green Communities Division in particular can help you with. Okay, so to break that down, there were some more specific questions. So this one was about communities that are current stretch code communities, and will those communities have to do anything to adopt the updates to the stretch code? So the answer to that is fairly clean. if you're a current stretch code community and you plan to stay a stretch code community, then you don't need to do anything. This is actually the third significant update to the stretch code. And assuming you adopted the stretch code as a bylaw, when the underlying regulations that the bylaws reference update, then your community automatically moves to the new updated version. And in the regs, essentially the old regs disappear and the new regs replace them. So if you're a stretch code community right now and you plan to remain a stretch code community, then this will just take effect in early 2023 when the base code and the stretch code update. And we are trying to harmonize the timing with the BBRS on their base code updates. So that's the only uncertainty around the date. Okay, the next question was about, are green communities required to adopt the specialized code, the new municipal opt-in code? And this was actually addressed very clearly in the 2021 Climate Roadmap Act. So I copied in here a section from section 98A. And essentially what it says is that if you're a green community, then you do not have to adopt the municipal opt-in specialized code to remain a green community. You would be able to be a green community under the regular stretch code or under the municipal opt-in stretch code. So, so green communities have a choice. And Joanne is on the line here, can talk more about how the Green Communities Program will support that. But I think it's safe to say that the Green Communities Division will be happy to support communities with the choice either way. Next question is about current base code communities and what their options are. So it says, is there option to adopt the full updated stretch code with or without specialized code? And the short answer to that is yes. So if you're a base code community today and a base code community in 2023, then you will be able to stay a base code community or adopt the stretch code, which would be obviously the updated version, or go straight to the specialized opt-in code. So hopefully that's fairly straightforward. And then last question in this topic is about integrating into one energy code for all communities. This is something that we've heard about for the lifespan of the stretch code, since 2010 when it was first adopted, the idea of sort of bringing all the codes back together. And it was also mentioned as a strategy in the draft Clean Energy and Climate Plan for 2030. So I think we understand where this question is coming from. But as of right now, and as the Climate Act was written, we don't have any plan to roll the stretch code and specialized opt-in code and base code back into one energy code. That could change if the legislature gives us future direction. But at the moment, the way we read the legislation is that we are to provide communities with these three options, and that you at the local level get to decide what your community is ready to commit to. Okay. Next section is about the straw proposal itself and the process and public hearings. I think this will be fairly quick. One of the questions pointed out that the Climate Act requires 5 public hearings, and we are holding 5 hearings in the next couple of weeks. And so I think this raised the question of, are these the one and only chance to weigh in on this topic? And And these are the 5 public hearings, starting with the Western Mass region later today. But the answer is that this is just round 1 of public hearings on the stretch codes straw proposal. We have it fairly compact here because we want to hear from people, get feedback early on some of the big fundamental decisions in this, and that will inform the code language that we put together and put out later this spring. And then once we have that code language out, we'll be more in the realm of a traditional regulatory public hearing. And so there'll be a second round of public hearings and a second public comment period over this summer before we finalize the code language. So we hope that you will be able to participate in and provide comments at one of these hearings. You can also send written comments to stretchcode@mass.gov, and we have a slide on that too. Okay, this is a fair question. Why did we wait until Monday afternoon to let folks know about a straw proposal release on Tuesday morning? So this was less than ideal timing, but we did want to get our webinar and our proposal out as soon as we could, and coordinated with a number of state agencies on getting that out. So apologies for not giving people more advance notice on the webinar. We did record it and put it up on the website that I showed earlier. And we are endeavoring to keep a flow of information through that website and through the sign-up list to get announcements on the stretch code proposal. So recognize that it was a very rapid turnaround, and I'm impressed with the number of people that made it to that initial webinar. You didn't really miss much if you missed that webinar, because it's available on the website to view it to your heart's content. Another interesting question, what changes were made to the draft language written by DOER staff last summer between September and February when it was finally released? So I want to dispel any rumors that we have all of our code language written and that we've been modifying it. We have been working with 2 teams of consultants, one a residential team and one a commercial team, to look at different building code options and approaches, and do a lot of analysis because we recognize the importance of getting this combination of building codes right. But we do not have any, certainly did not have any finalized or draft language written last summer. So we are trying to take feedback before we finalize language so that it can inform what we do going forwards. And we'll be releasing reports on the work of our consultant teams as and when we have completed that work, which is still feverishly going on. Okay. Just to note that I can't really see if there are questions or comments, or if others want to jump in. So I will just keep going, and on the grounds that we want to be efficient with time, unless somebody jumps in and tells me otherwise.
No, that's a great plan, and you keep going, and we'll get to the chat questions once you're done here.
Okay, great. So in terms of the scope, there was a question here about major renovations, actually 2 questions about major renovations and the stretch codes. And so this is an important question, and I think something that we would welcome public comment on. But essentially, under the current stretch code, major renovations, there is a trigger for when they should apply the code for new construction. and when they're treated as renovations or additions. So there's a chapter 4 for new construction, and then a chapter 5 for renovations and additions. And so the scope that we have put out in this straw proposal is really only covering those chapter 4 new construction and major renovations that trigger new construction. I think that we recognize that there's an awful lot of existing buildings and also some renovations and additions to existing buildings that have not historically been covered by the Stretch Energy Code. And they're not really covered in the analysis that we've done to date. So we're very much interested in public comment on this and where it makes sense to extend the stretch code to cover different renovations and additions. But as you'll see in the straw proposal right now, it's essentially covering the code for new construction. As we'll get to later, there are other policy tools and opportunities for existing buildings and other buildings. Okay, 2 questions, essentially very similar questions, came in about aligning the Stretch Energy Code with the 2030 emissions limits. And the first question also referenced minimizing life cycle costs. Minimizing life cycle costs, I think, comes out of the Green Communities Act rather than the Global Warming Solutions Act. But I think we understand the concern here, and we share it. So we are part of the team that Energy and Environmental Affairs organizes to work on a 2030 clean energy and climate plan for the Commonwealth. Obviously, the building sector, as Cami pointed out, is a big part of that. And then within the building sector, new construction is a significant part of that too. So our goal is to put forward a proposal that does help us to meet our 2030 emissions reductions goals. So I guess the short answer is yes, but there are obviously different levers we can pull, and we can get slightly more or slightly less out of new construction, depending on some of the decisions that get made after this public comment period. So just to delve into that a little bit more, the life cycle cost effectiveness, I'm pulling up a slide from the webinar on the Green Communities Act. That is a requirement of the Stretch Energy Code, that we minimize to the extent feasible the life cycle cost of facilities. So you see that in the bottom left here. That's slightly different than the requirements for the Municipal opt-in specialized code that you'll see in the second column here. And then in the third column, you'll see that the state has to establish emissions reduction targets for the building sector for 2025 and 2030 this summer. So the Building Energy Code will play into that. The next slide kind of gives you a sense of the impact of building code, given that building code is primarily impacting new buildings. We see that covering a quarter, slightly more than a quarter of all of the building construction, of all the buildings that will be in place in 2050. So this green wedge here are new buildings that have yet to be built, that will be built under these proposed stretch codes and any future building code updates. So yes, they're a significant part of meeting our 2030 goals and our 2050 goals, but there is also all this blue here, and that will require additional policies and tools to help reduce the emissions from those buildings. In terms of how much we're projecting to get just from the stretch code for new construction, this again is a slide from the webinar, and the second bullet here shows that, at a minimum, we're looking at about 500,000 tons a year of reduction in 2030 as a result of these stretch energy codes as we've proposed right now. And that does grow a little bit to 2035 and then levels off. That's on an annual basis. The other thing that our analysis has shown is that we can do this in a way that actually saves money and makes more money available for reinvesting in the Massachusetts economy. And that's maybe a difference between the potential of the opportunity for new construction and the potential in existing buildings, where retrofitting existing buildings will save money, but it's not as cost effective as the sort of design and implementation that we can do in new construction. Okay, another big question about fossil fuels in the specialized code. So both the stretch code as proposed and the specialized opt-in code as proposed are allowing builders and developers to use fossil fuels in their buildings. We're very aware of the discussion around restricting or limiting that. We've seen that a number of municipalities are working on that. I'm guessing that a number of folks on this webinar are aware that the Attorney General had to disapprove a second round of bylaws from Brookline. And if you take a look at what the Attorney General's letter says there, essentially it points out that there are multiple laws and regulations in place at the moment that make it difficult to give municipalities the authority to ban fossil fuel connections. Now, the state building code is listed as one of those, but legally, and I'm not a lawyer, but our legal team is not sure that we can restrict fossil fuel use through the building code and survive a challenge because of the other existing laws in place. So this is something that the legislature could look at and clarify for everyone. In the interim, our approach is to say electrically heated buildings have a sort of 10 to 15% residential market share today, more like a 50–60% market share in commercial buildings today. We want to make sure that we're helping to accelerate that market, but doing so in an economically viable and attractive way for developers and builders. And so I'm just going to show this slide again from our analysis, showing that, and this is really very similar to a slide that Cami showed in her introduction, although we've updated the emissions factors that Cami showed, and the benefits of electrification for emissions are even better than Cami was showing. So we do understand the importance of moving towards electrification. It's a question of what are the policy tools to move in that direction.
And Ian, I'm just going to jump in and add to this that both the residential and commercial codes will radically lower the space heating of buildings. We're talking like 70 to 90% smaller space heating. It really makes little sense for a designer builder to add another system of fossil fuels to manage these very small remaining heating loads in new buildings. So the code is really designed to have it just almost not make sense to continue to use gas. It just makes more sense to use electrification under this new efficiency code.
Yeah, thank you for that, Paul. And we can get more into that in questions if there's time. So another key issue, and we only got one question from this group on this, but we've seen this question from other stakeholders, is about the net zero definition that we've put forwards in our straw proposal. So I think this is a quite well phrased question. The draft appears to allow on-site fuel combustion for heating, domestic hot water, cooking, other uses, and how is this consistent with achieving net zero operations? So, I mean, a couple of things here just to clarify. There are multiple definitions of net zero that include fossil fuels. So even on a single building basis, if you have some fossil fuels in a building, you can offset that with renewables or other clean energy sources, either on-site or off-site, depending on the definition. So I think we want to separate out the fossil fuel use from the net zero definition. And then when we're thinking about net zero definition, really thinking about the application to building codes and how they apply to different buildings in different site conditions. And that is something that we've been giving quite a lot of thought to, and really do welcome public comment on, because it is as we think about it more, it's not a simple and straightforward thing to operationalize in the new construction sector. So I'm just going to recap some of the slides we've previously shown, and then this slide is actually slightly different. This slide includes the text from the Massachusetts 2050 Decarbonization Roadmap to sort of give people the sort of source of where we came to our net zero approach. Going back to the Climate Act asks us to have an opt-in specialized code that is compliant with meeting our 2030 and 2050 goals. And so we really took the sort of long-term view of this and are looking to have new construction be 2050 ready or 2050 compatible. That obviously has some implications, and I think is a surprise to many stakeholders relative to some of the other net zero definitions that we've seen and looked at in code or in some of the submittals that the BBRS received and that DOER has received too. So what does the net zero proposal that we've put out look like? So I covered this briefly in the intro, but it means on the residential side, if you're adding any fossil fuel use to the building, whether that's for cooking or space heating or everything, that will trigger a solar requirement and pre-wiring for future electrification. The solar requirement, though, is not to take that building to a HERS 0. And HERS 0, the HERS rating allows for solar to be counted. So this HERS 42 number, and I should have clarified this earlier, this is a number before any renewable generation. And then, adding solar, you can get to exactly HERS 0, and then you have an exactly net zero home. You can add additional solar if your site allows and have an energy positive home, which we've seen the city of Boston and other folks produce. But it is very dependent on site conditions. So we know there are a lot of homes that are under mature tree cover, and we don't want to set up a situation where there's an incentive to be logging established trees in order to create solar access to meet net zero standard, or similarly, on the commercial side, we don't want to encourage, greenfield development having an advantage over urban infill or brownfield reuse or transit accessible development, which is likely to have less of a solar window to meet that net zero on-site requirement. There are a number of other issues as well, with things like the building code really governing, really looking at buildings in a snapshot at the time of pulling a permit and the time of issuing a certificate of occupancy, where the traditional net zero definition is really a net zero over a period of time, typically an annual period. That would really extend the scope for local municipal officials to be regulating buildings past the certificate of occupancy into the first year or the first several years of their use. And so to align with net zero, we might be looking at something like a building performance standard that's an ongoing reporting mechanism as a better way to track that than net zero. At the same time, we have a statutory requirement to have net zero performance standards. So a lot there, and a lot that we hope that we will receive public comment on. Just gonna skip over these slides a little bit, but this is a slide summarizing the net zero requirement for residential with fossil fuels, and then this next slide is the same thing for commercial buildings. And you'll see that we're being consistent across residential and commercial in saying that if a building is going to use fossil fuels, then they have to pre-wire for future electrification and also have solar on the roof to make sure that they are contributing to some near-term emissions reductions, as well as being able to be net zero well before 2050. So I'm going to stop there because that was all of the previously received questions. Paul and I can stay on a little bit longer if there are questions from the audience today. And just once again, want to show people that this is where you can submit written comments on the straw proposal.
Fabulous. Thank you, Ian. And I think that was really helpful to walk through a number of the questions and concerns and just some of the places that needed greater clarity for a lot of stakeholders. So really appreciate you taking the time to dig through that. There are a number of good questions in the chat. So I think let's move to somewhat of a lightning round of those to the extent that you and Paul and Joanne or others are able to answer them. And I appreciate you being willing to stay on for a few extra minutes. Don't want to keep you too long with that evening session tonight, but it'd be great to get through a number of these. So I'll start off. The first one that came in was asking a little bit more clarity about the rationale for EV readiness in the net zero code being set at 20%, and noted that Boston and soon Cambridge will require 25% for actual EV charging installed and then 75% for EV ready for their large buildings, which extends well beyond that 20%. So I wonder if you can talk for a minute to that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that this is a relatively new area of regulation, and we've seen a lot of cities and states are looking at what the right level of, or the right percentage of parking spaces is. And I don't think we know the exact answer. The 20% seems to be the most common approach in our survey of 20 or so different jurisdictions that have gotten into this. And I think I'm not our EV expert, but I think that the premise behind this is that even with a fully electric vehicle, you don't typically need to charge every night. Most people are not driving sort of 200 miles a day or whatever is needed. And so it's more important to have reliable charging access than to have ubiquitous charging access. So the 20% requirement, and it's 10% in the base code, is written as 50 amp circuit access, but then we allow for slower charging in multiples of that. So instead of having one level 2 50 amp charger, you can provide 3 level 1 20 amp chargers, which would be where you would need all night to charge for a lot of electric vehicles. So that 20% is sort of 20% at a home fast charger level, which there's flexibility to make that, say, 60% at a level 1 charger level. And we've been looking at some of the newer systems that that sort of flexibly allocate load depending on how many vehicles are charging. So our goal is to make EV readiness as described, make parking lots ready to service the needs of a high penetration of electric vehicles. But we're not sure that we need to go to 50% or 75% of spaces with level 2 charging to meet that need. Thanks.
And next, a question about if you could talk a little bit more about vertically integrated mixed use buildings, how they would fit into, I'm assuming, the commercial code.
Yeah, Paul, do you want to try taking that one?
Sure. I'm not sure if I understand the question, but I'll guess what I think the question is asking. So the commercial code applies to, has different buckets of requirements depending on building type. And if a project had mixed use, then each of those uses would be would follow the criteria for its use. So again, I'm not sure if I understand that question. Just anticipating what I think they asked.
Thanks, Paula. And Joyce, if you're still here and want to add any further clarifying questions in the chat, please feel free to do so. Next question about kind of the timing. There was some confusion around kind of the summer 2023 and beyond column of the slide that gave that timeline. So if you could speak a little bit more about kind of the expectations for that time period, as well as the reference to the HERS phasing in part of that, which was in the stretch code category row. And then there was another question later on about whether there would be concurrency periods and when the codes would actually go into effect fully. So maybe if you can address those together.
Yeah, okay, I can take a crack at that, and then Joanne, if you want to jump in as well. I think the way stretch code adoption happens now is generally through town meeting or city council action, and then that it approves a bylaw, and then that bylaw gets approved by the Attorney General, hopefully, and then it would typically take effect as soon as it's approved, unless you put in an effective date. And so, given that there are 351 cities and towns, we've asked communities to select an effective date of either January 1st or July 1st, just to minimize confusion for the construction industry and pulling permits and tracking compliance and so on. And that seems to have been working pretty well. In terms of the building codes themselves, the Attorney General has ruled that the building code can't really have a compliance period, but it can do the same thing as a municipal bylaw. And in passing that code, it can state an effective date. And so that is what the BVRS has moved to doing, and I think plans to do. So when they publish their base code, they will state in it what the effective date will be. We'll plan to do the same for the stretch code updates, so that all the stretch code communities know with the date certain when that transition is happening, and the construction industry knows that too. And then on the municipal opt-in side, we're assuming that municipalities will select an effective date that's either January 1 or July 1, and typically with at least 6 months notice to the construction community that that change is happening.
Great, thank you. And then for that item that said the phase in HERS requirements for the stretch code in summer 2023 and beyond, you clarify that?
Yeah, so so we've been talking a lot about moving to HERS 42 and HERS 45. We've had significant comments suggesting that we shouldn't do that immediately for all the stretch code communities, but so we've planned to allow the year of 2023 to be on the HERS 52 level that the base code is moving to, and then effective December 2023 or January 2024 is when that HERS 42, 45 step would take. So it's a phase in. You'll also see we have that same approach to phasing in multifamily passive house requirements in the specialized code, where we start with low-rise multifamily in the specialized opt-in code would be passive house to begin with, but then mid-rise and high-rise buildings would have an extra year to kind of make that transition.
Great, thank you. And if I remember correctly, at least for the opt-in code, that was something that the Climate Act explicitly allowed, that kind of phasing in approach. So that's helpful to see how that's being applied. A couple more questions, if you guys are able to stick around just for a few more minutes. One is about kind of, as wiring is required for electricity, even if fossil fuels are used in the buildings, is that something where the building owners or those who buy those buildings might then be stuck with some equipment that becomes obsolete? Are we kind of giving folks, future costs by putting in that wiring at the onset while allowing them to have fossil fuel equipment?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of wiring up front is to avoid obsolescence of the building rather than to add obsolescence. So I think we are very confident that the future is going to be very much all electric, and it's much more inexpensive to supply that electric supply service and wiring when the building's being constructed than to try and go in and retrofit it later. And we'll be dealing with a lot of retrofitting of existing buildings. So I don't think we want to add to that challenge with new buildings. And we've seen, there's language in front of the national model codes for pre-wiring for residential buildings. That's relatively straightforward and relatively simple to do. For different commercial buildings, we're looking at the details of that, and maybe Paul can speak to this, but by addressing the heating loads, we can make that not a significant change in electric service. In fact, a lot of the modeling of the codes that we have in our straw proposal shows that these buildings don't necessarily have higher peak loads. So when you're moving from gas heat to electric heat, the assumption is that you're going to need more electric service. But depending on the building type, you don't actually need more electric service. So you would use more electricity in winter than you used to, but you may still have a summer peaking building with electric heating and electric cooling. I don't know, Paul, if you want to elaborate on that.
I think you covered it.
Great. I think just two more questions, and they might be somewhat tricky, but to the extent that you are able to answer them. One question you had mentioned about the Attorney General's recent finding that on the second provision put forward by Brookline, and there was a question around, that that legal challenge that could come to be if, you know, if building code tried to say ban fossil fuels or allow cities and towns to take that step. And there was, I think the question is, you know, is there are you not allowed to put forward a regulation that could be legally challenged, that might not survive a legal challenge, especially since you don't know for sure that it might be challenged?
Yeah, so okay, that's a great question. So yes, DOER could put forward an outright ban or do something more like what New York City has done recently, which is not an explicit ban on fossil fuels, but it's a requirement for electrification. We're actually proposing a partial electrification requirement for high ventilation buildings, but it's not going as far as New York City. So there are differences in what we could do. I would note, however, that our understanding is that New York State did amend their gas right to serve legislation, and that was a key legislative action that allowed New York City to move forwards with their higher electrification requirement. And then just I think there's a broader question of, is the building energy code the place to make that action happen? We want to make sure that nothing slows down the many good things in this straw proposal, and one of the hurdles we have to go through is the Building Code Coordinating Council, where we sit down with the other building codes, including the gas code, the pipe fitters code, fire codes, and so on. And if we have something that is in conflict, then we go through an extensive process to try and work that out. But that would slow down potentially the timeline for the building code, with ripple effects on other things. So could we do more? Yes. Are we interested in public comments on how to navigate this? Absolutely. Is this the only tool in the toolbox to address that issue? Absolutely not. And so I think that there are multiple policy tools that could really work on this issue.
That's really helpful. Thanks for that insight. One last question, and then I'll bring up the slide on resources and next steps and let you all get ready for the session tonight. There was a question about, and this might be something that you can't answer today, but I think is good food for thought around, you know, if a community were to adopt the new specialized opt-in code, if that might, or how it might affect the ability for that community to then qualify for utility incentives that are based on doing better than code. So, you know, if we're raising the floor on what your code is, and so therefore you're not going to do as much better as you might have of keeping it base, or even just the, you know, the updated stretch code, you know, how does that interplay work? And I don't know if that's something that you might have an answer to already, but seems like an interesting piece to think about.
Yeah, no, that very question came up way back in 2008, 2009, when we were designing the first stretch energy code. And the agreement that we came to at that point in time with the utilities, with the Attorney General's office as well, was that we wanted to treat the baseline for the utility programs as a statewide baseline. So the utility programs look at not specifically what the building code says, they look at standard industry market practice. So they look at what is typical construction methods, and they can do that in a statewide survey. And so in taking that approach, it doesn't penalize communities that do show leadership and adopt more stringent standards. And so that was the agreement with the original stretch code, and we see no reason to change that going forwards, because otherwise you have an unintended consequence of, you know, utility programs being unable to give the same level of incentive to a stretch code community that they would to a base code community. And that would be a disincentive for communities to become stretch code communities in the first place, which is not something that the utilities want to do, and it's not very good public policy.
Perfect.
So
I knew it had been
solve
addressed
that
for
one.
stretch code communities, but didn't remember how or why, and glad to hear that would be rolled over as well into this new code. There are some more questions coming in. We will share those with you in case there's something that you're able to answer in another form or in another time, and just for your own edification. Right now, to get everybody on their way, I do want to just go to the last slide that I have to share with you all, which is here on ways to participate going forward. You saw Ian's slide earlier about the public hearings coming up, including starting at 6 p.m. tonight. So please stay engaged, follow along on the website, submit written comments, go to these hearings, provide verbal comments. We also have some resources for you, and encourage you to stay tuned for others that we'll add there. So you find more about this webinar, and we'll put the recording and slides up as soon as we're able to on our Codes for Climate webpage. If you haven't already seen our statement that we put out, once the stretch code proposal and the new opt-in code proposal, straw proposals released, you can access that there. And again, I'll share around these slides, and our Municipal Net Zero Playbook that we referenced earlier, which has a lot of those other approaches that can be taken to help decarbonize your buildings and move closer to net zero, especially on the local level. There's much more information there. So thank you to everyone. Thank you very much to our presenters from DOER. Really appreciate you being here and putting in so much time on this busy day. Thank you to all of the folks that stuck with us, still over 40 that are here. And thank you, everyone. Have a really good night.